photograph rested in silence for more than a century, tucked away in a quiet corner of the Boston Historical Society's archives. Its edges had yellowed the sepia tones, softened by time, yet the date on the back remained sharp and certain. June 15th, 1910. It was a family portrait, or at least, that's what it first appeared to be. The image showed the well-known Matthews family arranged neatly in the parlor of their grand Victorian home. Richard Matthews, a prosperous textile merchant, stood tall and proud beside his wife Elizabeth. Their 3 children, William, Margaret, and little James, sat properly in front, their posture as formal as their finely tailored clothing. Even without knowing their names, the signs of wealth almost speak aloud. Persian rugs spill across the polished floor. Heavy mahogany furniture gleams in the careful light, and oil paintings in gilded frames watch from the walls like silent witnesses. A picture of success, the kind Boston's upper crust admired at the turn of the century. For decades, no one questioned the photograph. It was catalogued, stored, and forgotten. Until 2023, when historian Dr. Elena Wells stumbled upon it while preparing an exhibition on Boston's industrial families. Dr. Wells was no ordinary researcher. With a doctorate in American social history, she had built a quiet reputation for uncovering the details other historians overlooked, those faint threads that, when pulled, can unravel a whole tapestry. At first glance, the Matthews portrait looked ordinary. Stiff poses, serious expressions, the careful composition common to early 20th century photography. But as Dr. Wells examined the print under archival lights, something stopped her. There by the window in the background, a small figure emerged. A child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The face was slightly blurred, but the eyes seemed to look directly at the camera, directly at her. The child's clothing was plain, almost out of place among the silks and polished shoes of the Matthews children, and their position, standing apart, framed by the window, felt too deliberate to be accidental. Yet every record of the Matthews family insisted there were only 3 children. No 4th name appeared in family genealogies, no whispered mention in social columns. Dr. Wells noted in her research journal, "The identity of this child is completely undocumented. There is no trace of their existence in any of the materials I have examined thus far. Could this mysterious figure have been added later, a trick of double exposure?" Preservation experts quickly dismissed that idea. The photograph was an untouched original from 1910. Whoever stood in that window was present when the camera shutter clicked. Dr. Wells began the painstaking work of verification. Census records from that very year listed only 5 residents at the Matthews Commonwealth Avenue home: Richard, Elizabeth, and the 3 children, William, age 15, Margaret, 12, and James, 8. No 4th child. Birth records at the Massachusetts State Archives confirmed it. Elizabeth Matthews had given birth only to those 3, with medical notes recording complications after James's arrival that made further pregnancies impossible. Even the parish books of the family's Episcopal Church told the same story. Baptisms, confirmations, Sunday school attendance, all recorded with careful precision, all for only 3 children. Still, the photograph would not be explained away. Dr. Wells widened her search, combing through school enrollment lists, city directories, and neighborhood maps from 1908 to 1912. What she found was mundane yet curious. The Matthews family employed 2 live-in servants, an Irish cook, and a Swedish housekeeper. They occasionally hosted relatives for extended visits, but none of those visitors matched the child's age or appearance. The documentary evidence presents a clear contradiction to what we can plainly see in the photograph Dr. Wells told her colleagues at the Boston Historical Society. Either this child was deliberately omitted from every official record, or they held some connection to the household that fell outside the usual boundaries of documentation. A fragile clue surfaced among Elizabeth Matthews' personal papers. In a letter, dated March 1910, just 3 months before the photograph was taken, Elizabeth wrote cryptically of arrangements for C being finalized. No explanation followed. The initial C appeared again in her appointment books of the same period, always linked to meetings of her charity organization. Who was C.A. relative, hidden from public view, a child taken in through the quiet channels of private philanthropy? Or someone or something else entirely? The photograph remains silent. The blurred figure by the window offers no answers. But once you've seen those watchful eyes, it is difficult to look away. And so the question lingers, softly unsettling, if the records of an entire city can arouse a single child. What other histories might be waiting unseen in the shadows of old photographs? The child's position in the photograph was not a mistake. Standing slightly apart, almost melting into the shadow of the bay window, they occupied a space both inside and outside the Matthews household. Present, yet not presented. Seen, yet somehow excluded. Dr. Elena Wells lingered over this detail. To her trained eye, the physical separation in the portrait echoed something deeper, the way this figure existed within the family's walls, but not within its recorded history. What did it mean to be visible in the room, but invisible on the page? This contradiction became the heart of mystery that refused to let go. To test her instincts, Dr. Wells sent the photograph to Dr. Thomas Anderson at the Smithsonian Institution. Anderson, a quiet authority in early photographic techniques, had spent 3 decades examining images for signs of manipulation and hidden truths. His analysis would prove whether the child was a trick of light or something far stranger. A week later, Anderson's report arrived. It read like the slow unwrapping of a secret. The figure is not an anomaly, he wrote. Not a flaw, not a reflection, not a double exposure. The child was physically present when the photograph was taken standing roughly 6 feet behind the family group near the bay window of what appears to be the Matthews parlor. Advanced digital enhancement revealed more than the naked eye could catch. The child had dark hair and wore clothing neither fine nor shabby. Simple, well-made, but conspicuously less formal than the Matthews children in their portrait silks. Not a servant's uniform, not the attire of a passing visitor. Something in between. Even more striking was their posture. The small figure stood perfectly still facing the camera with quiet certainty. Notice the eyes, Anderson pointed out. This child is looking directly into the lens. They understood what was happening. Given the long exposure times required in 1910, several seconds of absolute stillness, this was no accidental capture. The photographer, and likely the family, intended for this child to be part of the composition. And yet, apart from it, lighting analysis only deepened the certainty. The shadows falling across the parlor matched perfectly with the natural light from the window. In a decorative mirror on the opposite wall, Anderson detected the faint reflection of the child proof beyond doubt, that the figure belonged to the original scene. But one detail unsettled him most. On the windowsill, just beside the child's elbow, lay a small card or note. Even under magnification, its writing was too fine to decipher. Still, its deliberate placement suggested meaning. Someone wanted it seen, if not read. This photograph tells a carefully constructed story, Anderson concluded in his final statement. The inclusion of the child was intentional. Their separation from the family grouping was equally intentional. In the visual language of the period, this spatial arrangement communicated something about status and relationship that contemporary viewers would have understood immediately. We, more than a century later, are left to guess. Dr. Wells felt a quiet shiver as she read the report. If this was a message, who had been meant to understand it? Her research soon carried her beyond the photograph itself. While combing through Boston's newspaper archives, she uncovered an unexpected thread in the life of Richard Matthews. In late 1909, his name surfaced repeatedly in the city's papers, sometimes in society columns celebrating the family's social standing, and sometimes in the grittier pages of labor reports. The Boston Globe described him as a forward-thinking industrialist, a man praised by business partners for modern methods and cautious generosity. Yet the Boston Labor Standard painted a more conflicted portrait. Matthews, they noted, was less harsh than most mill owners, but hardly a friend to the working class. One story in particular caught Dr. Wells' attention, a series of articles covering a textile workers' strike at one of Matthews' factories in November 1908. The strike followed a tragic accident at the mill the previous October, an incident severe enough to force Matthews into implementing new safety measures. Was it coincidence that the mysterious child appeared in the family photograph less than 2 years after that accident? Could the shadowed figure in the window somehow belong to the world of the mill, rather than the polished life of Commonwealth Avenue? The answers, if they exist, remain tucked away in brittle letters, yellowed newspapers, and that silent photograph, an image that invites you to look closer and closer still, as if the child by the window might finally speak if only someone were patient enough to listen. The accident that shadowed the Matthews family story came to light in an old Boston Globe article dated October 15, 1908. The report described a tragedy inside one of Richard Matthews's own textile mills. A spinning machine malfunctioned without warning, killing 3 workers and injuring several others. Among the dead was a widow named Mary Alley. She left behind a single child, an 8-year-old daughter. The article lingered on the shock that rippled through Boston's South End, where many of the factory's Irish immigrant workers lived. A follow-up piece published on November 3rd noted something unusual. Richard Matthews had made private arrangements for the ongoing welfare of the victims' families, providing support that went far beyond the standard compensation of the day. Specifics were not revealed, but the action itself was striking enough to calm tensions that might otherwise have ignited a prolonged strike. Dr. Eleanor Wells read those lines with growing unease. Could this nameless daughter, the lone survivor of Mary Alley's small household, be connected to the shadowed child in the Matthews photograph? Her suspicion deepened when she found a society column from April 1910. It praised Elizabeth Matthews for her deepening involvement with the Children's Aid Society, a charity devoted to placing orphans with families or reputable institutions. According to the column, Elizabeth's dedication to the cause had intensified over the past year, a period that began only months after the factory accident. Dr. Wells wrote quietly in her journal. The timeline aligns perfectly. The factory accident in October 1908. Elizabeth's growing charity work through 1909. The first mysterious references to C in March 1910. And finally, the photograph taken in June 1910 with the unidentified child by the window. But it was the family's own papers that offered the most intimate revelation. Among the Matthews materials at the Historical Society rested a set of household account books preserved with remarkable care. Elizabeth Matthews had kept these ledgers from 1900 through 1915, documenting every purchase from grand furniture to the smallest household expense. Beginning in November 1909, a new entry appeared with quiet regularity. Monthly provision for C18 tolls. The notation repeated month after month, continuing through 1912. Occasional additional entries followed C clothing for CC medical expenses, each small but unmistakable. In February 1910, a larger single expense stood out: room arrangements for C$42. Economic historian Dr. Rachel Harris, assisting Dr. Wells, placed these amounts into modern context. $18 a month in 1910 equates to roughly $500 today, enough to support a child's basic needs, but notably less than the generous allowances recorded for the Matthews' own children. Whoever C was, Dr. Harris observed they were cared for, but not as a member of the family in full. The ledger continued to speak. By September 1910, entries included CUR school supplies and primer books, suggesting the child had begun formal lessons. In 1912 came notes for C books, special instruction, and even C examination fees, all evidence of an ongoing education carefully funded, yet always recorded as a separate category, never mingled with the accounts of William Margaret or James. Then came the breakthrough, a single December 1910 entry that seemed almost to breathe Christmas gift for Catherine, $350. For the first time, the mysterious initial had a name. Catherine. Subsequent holiday notes followed listing gifts for Catherine alongside those for the Matthews children. The amounts, however, remained consistently smaller, a quiet but telling hierarchy written in ink. Catherine was cared for but kept at a distance, cherished and set apart all at once. These account books whispered a story of sustained support that went beyond mere charity. Catherine was not simply a name in a ledger. She was a living presence inside the Matthews home. Yet the careful separation in financial records mirrored the physical separation in the family portrait. Neither servant nor acknowledged daughter, she occupied an in-between space, visible but never fully claimed. Dr. Wells's search of Elizabeth Matthews' personal correspondence offered even more haunting insight. In letters to her sister in New York, Elizabeth began mentioning Catherine in late 1909, slowly sketching a portrait of the child's quiet existence. One letter dated December 18, 1909, was particularly revealing. Catherine has begun to settle in. She speaks rarely but watches everything with those solemn eyes. Richard believes maintaining distance is prudent considering the circumstances, but I find myself drawn to the child. The circumstances of her coming to us remain a weight on my conscience, though I know we have done what is right by her. The words seem to hover on the page considering the circumstances. A weight on my conscience. What were those circumstances? Had Catherine been placed in the Matthews home as an act of charity? Or was there something in her origin that the family feared to name. And if Catherine was indeed the daughter of Mary Ali, the mill worker killed in the 1908 accident, what promise or secret bound the Matthews family to her so tightly that they brought her into their home, yet never into their official records? The photograph remains a blurred figure by the window, a small card resting on the sill, a name finally spoken only in the quiet ink of account books. Catherine. Present yet absent, watched yet never fully welcomed, as you picture her standing there. Dark hair, simple dress, eyes fixed on the camera. Do you wonder, as Dr. Wells surely did, what Catherine herself might have whispered had anyone thought to ask? The letters continued to speak their ink, carrying a quiet weight across more than a century. In a note from February 1910, Elizabeth Matthews wrote with careful resolve, "I have arranged a small room for Catherine, adjacent to the servants' quarters, but with better appointments." Richard questioned the necessity of such accommodations, but I reminded him of his promise after the accident. He relented, though insists we maintain proper boundaries. The child needs stability after such tragedy, and I intend to provide it within the constraints of our situation. Elizabeth's words revealed a delicate balance. Compassion threaded through social caution. A child sheltered but not embraced. By April 1910, the letters showed subtle shifts within the household. The children have different reactions to Catherine's presence, Elizabeth confided. William remains aloof. Margaret has shown unexpected kindness in teaching her to sew, and young James seems to have found a quiet companion for his reading. We maintain propriety in public, of course, but within our home some natural affection has developed, despite Richard's concerns about excessive attachment. Even in the privacy of her own writing, Elizabeth acknowledged the invisible lines Richard insisted on drawing. Catherine could be protected, but never fully claimed. A letter dated July 1912 carried the most striking development. Richard finally relented after seeing Catherine's exceptional performance on her examinations. She will join Margaret at the academy this autumn. It is not adoption. Richard is firm on this point, but it is a step toward providing her the opportunities her mother would have wished for her. The debt we owe can never truly be repaid, but perhaps this education might begin to balance the scales of justice. I only wish I could acknowledge her more openly without risking Richard's position or the family's standing. Those quiet admissions confirmed what Dr. Eleanor Wells had begun to suspect. Catherine, once a blurred figure by a parlor window, had entered the Matthews household not as a servant, but as the living echo of a tragedy Richard could not ignore, and a debt Elizabeth refused to leave unpaid. To understand the full context of this hidden arrangement, Dr. Wells turned to the recently donated records of the Matthews Textile Manufacturing Company at the Boston Industrial History Museum. There, among brittle papers and fading ink, she uncovered employment ledgers, accident reports, and private correspondence spanning 1900 to 1920. The name appeared plainly: Mary O'Malley, a widowed Irish immigrant hired as a spinner in 1905. Her file described her as reliable, punctual, skilled. No disciplinary notes, no complaints. She had lost her husband to pneumonia in 1903 and worked steadily for 3 years before the tragedy that ended her life. The accident report, dated October 14, 1908, told the story with clinical coldness. A malfunctioning spinning machine, a safety mechanism repeatedly reported as faulty repairs, delayed to avoid production interruptions, a common practice in those ruthless industrial years. 3 workers killed, among them Mary O'Malley. Internal correspondence between Richard Matthews and his factory manager revealed the company's uneasy response. The situation with the O'Malley child requires immediate attention, one memo read. There are no relations able to claim her in Boston, and the nearest family in Ireland cannot be reached. An orphanage seems the likely destination, though Mrs. Matthews has expressed reservations about this course of action, given the circumstances of the mother's passing. Another note, dated October 30th, 1908, carried Richard's own instructions in a firm but private hand. Mrs. Matthews suggests a temporary arrangement at our household, while more suitable permanent accommodations are determined. Proceed with discretion. The matter is to remain private, to avoid setting precedent with the other families affected. A subsequent memo written 6 months later hinted at growing unease among the factory workers. Rumors among the staff regarding your household's care for the O'Malley girl are causing comment. While your charity is commendable, it may be prudent to consider how this appears to those who lost family members without similar consideration. The union representatives have made informal inquiries about different treatment of victims' families. In the margin of this memo, Richard had scribbled a terse reply. The arrangement continues as established. Mrs. Matthews insists, "We will manage any complications." Those 7 words, Mrs. Matthews insists, seem to carry the force of quiet defiance. Dr. Wells followed Catherine's faint trail beyond the factory into Boston's educational archives. There were no public school records for a Catherine O'Malley between 1909 and 1911, suggesting she received private instruction during her first fragile years in the Matthews home, a common practice for children caught between worlds. Cross-referencing household records, Dr. Wells found confirmation. Elizabeth Matthews had arranged for the niece of her housekeeper, a trained governess, to teach Catherine the fundamentals of reading, writing, arithmetic, and what Elizabeth delicately called proper deportment. It was a curriculum of transition. Not quite the education of a servant, not yet. The schooling of Boston's elite. An education for a child destined to remain in the shadow of a grand house, yet never entirely swallowed by it. And so the story sharpens into focus. A widowed factory worker dies in an avoidable accident. Her daughter, 8 years old, solemn-eyed, enters the home of the man whose mill delayed the repair that killed her mother. There she is clothed, educated, and quietly loved, yet always kept at arm's length. Can a ledger of monthly provisions or a room beside the servants' quarters ever balance the scales of a life cut short? Elizabeth Matthews believed it might. Richard Matthews perhaps hoped it would, but what of Catherine herself? Did she stand by the window that June day in 1910 with gratitude, or with questions that no one dared to answer? The photograph remains the only reply, a child's unwavering gaze blurred by time, waiting for someone to finally see her. There are nights when Boston is shrouded in a thin fog, and the distant sound of train whistles is a reminder of the past people. Tell stories about an old family photo. A photo taken in 1910 in which a little girl stands by the window, her silent eyes seeming to contain a story that no one dares to name. That little girl, people later learned, had a simple but equally mysterious name, Catherine. To understand who Catherine was, we must turn the pages of old newspapers, each time-worn expense book. It all started with an industrial tragedy that occurred on October 14, 1908, A spinning machine in the Matthews textile mill suddenly malfunctioned, ripping off the safety mechanism, and in an instant 3 workers were killed. Many others were injured. One of them was Mary O'Malley, an Irish widow with an 8-year-old daughter. The Boston Globe of October 15th reported the incident in chilling detail, but what those words failed to convey was the shock that rippled through the South End home to a large concentration of Irish immigrant workers. Curiously, just a few weeks later, on November 3, 1908, another article appeared announcing that the factory owners, the Matthews family, had taken the initiative to provide for the affected families far beyond the usual compensation. No specific details were revealed, only that the gesture had somewhat appeased the simmering anger of the workers. Why would an industrial family be so considerate when the law required them to do nothing more? Were there in the shadows of the factory silent promises that were never recorded? In April 1910, a society column quietly mentioned Elizabeth Matthews, the mill owner's wife, and her increasingly persistent efforts in the Children's Aid Society, a charity that helped orphans find shelter. Her personal commitment has increased considerably during the past year, the article reported. The timing coincided strangely with other developments. The accident occurred in October 1908, and throughout 1909, Elizabeth became increasingly involved in charitable activities. By March 1910, the letter C appeared in her letters, and by June, a photograph of her with an unknown child appeared in the family archives. Dr. Wells, who patiently followed each trace, found the Matthews family's expense book carefully preserved from 1900 to 1915. Starting in November 1909, new expenses appeared regularly each month with the note "Provision for C, $18." There were also strange entries in the book, such as C clothing for C and medical expenses for C. In particular, in February 1910, there was a large expense, room arrangements for C, $42. A room had been prepared. But who was C? Why was such care taken? Dr. Rachel Harris, an economist who specializes in the value of money, during this period explains $18 a month at that time was equivalent to about $500 today. Enough to cover the basic needs of a child, but still much less than the amount of money spent on children in a wealthy family, like Matthews. Clearly, C was cared for, but always within a blurred line, neither child nor servant. By December 1910, a name appeared for the first time: Christmas gift for Catherine, $350. From here on holiday, gifts continued to bear Catherine's name, always listed separately lower but never forgotten. Catherine, the little girl standing by the window in that year's photograph, had lived in the Matthews house for many years, cared for, educated, but still held a strangely indifferent position. In private letters to her sister in New York, Elizabeth gradually revealed the story. In December 1909, she wrote, "Catherine has begun to settle down. She is quiet, but observes everything with a stern eye. Richard thinks it necessary to keep her distance, but I find my heart inclined towards the child. The situation torments me, but I believe I have done the right thing for her." In February 1910, Elizabeth continued, "I have arranged a small room for Catherine next to the servants' quarters, but more comfortable." Richard objected, but I reminded him of the promise I made after the accident. The child needs stability after the tragedy, and I will do everything I can. As the letters progressed, Catherine became part of the family. In April 1910, Elizabeth reported, "The children reacted differently to Catherine's presence. William remained aloof. Margaret unexpectedly taught her sewing, and James found a quiet companion for his reading hours. By July 1912, a turning point had come. Richard finally relented after seeing Catherine's excellent results in her examinations. She will join Margaret at the academy this autumn. Not adopted? Richard insisted, but at least it was a way of paying off some of the debt I owed. The letters confirmed what the factory records only hinted at. Catherine was the only daughter of Mary O'Malley, the woman who had died in the 1908 accident. Elizabeth had secretly brought Catherine home as an act of reparation, a moral obligation that could not be publicly acknowledged. In internal reports, Richard Matthews wrote clearly, "The O'Malley child needs to be arranged. No relatives in Boston. Mrs. Matthews has suggested that it be temporarily brought to our home. This must be kept secret to avoid setting a precedent." But rumors among the workers continued to spread. 6 months after the accident, a foreman sent a warning letter. "There is a murmur about your family taking care of the O'Malley daughter. The union has raised questions about discrimination against other families." Richard wrote in the margin only a brief line. "The arrangements remain in place. Mrs. Matthews will handle any inconvenience." During Catherine's early years at the Matthews, her name was not listed on any public school roster. Records show that Elizabeth had hired the housekeeper's niece, a trained governess, to teach Catherine reading, writing, arithmetic, and social graces. By September 1912, a new name appeared in the records of Brooklyn Ladies Academy, Catherine Matthews, listed as ward of the family, meaning a ward, not a foster child. A designation that opened the door to education but still maintained social boundaries. Catherine quickly excelled as a student, especially in math and literature. In 1918, the graduation yearbook noted Radcliffe College mathematics, a rare achievement for a girl from an immigrant working-class background. In the school's copy, someone had written in the margin scholarship, arranged by R. Matthews, exceptional case. Dr. Martin Cohen, a researcher of early 20th century American society, calls this story a moral gray area, where duty, compassion, and class lines intertwine. Work-related injuries were often compensated with only token compensation. It was unusual for the Matthews to raise Catherine to educate her, but they kept their distance. In the 1910 photograph, Catherine is pictured with the family, a daring act, but still standing apart by the window. Looking closely, we see both attachment and limitation, a silent message about the social order that the family could not break. Do you think in Catherine's quiet eyes in that photograph is gratitude or a question that will never be answered? Perhaps only the darkness of the Matthews house and the yellowing ledgers knows all the answers. There are stories that, even though they begin in the darkness of tragedy, quietly find a bright ending. Catherine, the little girl standing by the window in the Matthews family photo, is proof of that. Through patient research, through genealogical records, census records, academic documents, and scattered letters scattered throughout the collections, Dr. Wells has traced and pieced together the journey of that little girl. A path that led from an anonymous child in the Matthews living room to a life that far exceeded the limits of her birth. After graduating from Radcliffe College in 1922 with a degree in mathematics, a rare achievement for women at the time, Catherine Matthews, still named Matthews, despite never having been adopted, won a position teaching mathematics at a women's college in New York. Her appointment letter stated, "Excellent recommendation by professors praised for her sharp analytical thinking and tenacious will." The 1930 census records Catherine as a professor of mathematics, a position she held until her retirement in 1960. During those decades, she published numerous papers on statistical analysis, and with her colleagues developed a mathematics textbook that was widely used in girls' schools across the United States in the 1940s. Catherine never married. She lived with another female professor, one with similar background and interests, for many years, a common arrangement among independent intellectual women of the previous century. A quiet but active life, as if she had chosen to write her own story, independent of any framework. Letters found in Margaret Matthews's personal papers reveal that Catherine remained in contact with Margaret throughout her life. From a strange childhood relationship, they gradually became two educated women sharing thoughts on their place in a society with many boundaries. In a letter from 1945, Catherine wrote, "Though my beginnings were tinged with tragedy, the opportunity your family gave me changed everything. Your mother's kindness and your father's belated recognition of my abilities gave me a life I would otherwise have never had. I am grateful, though our relationship was never simple. We both understand that the photograph hanging in your father's study tells only part of the story. The child in the window finally found its place, though never in the center of the frame. Those words are a closing, but also open a silence that makes us wonder, was Catherine always aware of that gap? The gap between gratitude and the truth of the accident that brought her to the Matthews house. In 1965, Catherine established a scholarship fund for female students from working-class families, especially in the fields of science and mathematics. In the fundraising document, she wrote, "Education changed my life when circumstances seemed to have left me with only a closed future. I hope to give that opportunity to others, children whose parents sacrificed in the factories of America." Perhaps that was Catherine's last message, a message that needed no title, no photo frame. Just a silent continuation of kindness, going from the pain of a night of accident in a Boston textile factory in 1908 to the university doors opening for future generations. And tonight, if you happen to see an old photo with a child standing by the window, will you wonder, in those eyes, is there sadness? Is there gratitude? Or is there an equation of fate that only time can solve?